You ever stop and wonder if, what you see around you, what you touch and feel, is really the whole story? Or if consciousness, that sort of inner voice and sense of being, is it something more fundamental? Maybe not just neurons firing.
Absolutely. Those are the big questions, aren't they?
They really are. And it's those kinds of deep dives that we love here.
Yeah.
Today we're plunging into the, fascinating and sometimes kind of unsettling ideas of three brilliant minds who've really grappled with this stuff. Sir Roger Penrose, Federico Faggin, and Bernardo Kastrup.
Three heavy hitters.
Definitely. We've got this detailed analysis comparing their perspectives, plus we've looked at their own writings, interviews, the works.
Right.
So our mission today is basically to unpack their complex views, reality, consciousness, AI, and see where they surprisingly overlap,
Yeah.
and where they just fundamentally diverge.
It's a great comparison because they come from such different backgrounds.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding some really cutting-edge and, honestly, quite thought-provoking ideas in this whole area.
For sure. And what's really interesting is, like you said, different fields, physics for Penrose, technology for Faggin, philosophy for Kastrup, yet they all end up questioning that standard materialistic view.
The idea that matter is all there is.
Yeah, the view that dominates so much of science. They each end up proposing, in their own way, that consciousness plays a really significant role in how reality itself works.
Okay, so let's dive in. So Roger Penrose first, the Nobel Prize-winning mathematical physicist.
Sounds good.
His ideas on consciousness, they're pretty unique, aren't they? Starting with his orchestrated objective reduction theory. Orch OR.
Yeah, Orch OR, that's the one. Penrose kind of starts by looking at the quantum world, how strange it is.
Superposition and all that. Things
Yeah.
being in multiple states at once.
Exactly, that fuzziness. And then there's our world, the classical world, where everything seems definite. A cat is either alive or dead, not both.
Right, so the big question is how you get from A to B. From fuzzy quantum to sharp classical.
That's the mystery. And Penrose has a specific idea. He suggests it's actually gravity, not just us looking at something, not observation, but gravity itself, that forces these quantum possibilities to collapse into one definite state.
Gravity. Okay, that's different.
It is. And here's where it gets even wilder.
Yeah.
He talks about something called retrocausality, a kind of backward-in-time influence happening during this collapse process.
Whoa, hang on. Retrocausality. The future affecting the past at a quantum level.
Yeah, it's mind-bending stuff. But that's part of his model for how the quantum to classical transition happens.
Okay, so how does this connect to us, to consciousness?
Right, that's the orchestrated part of Orch OR. This is where the biology comes in. Penrose, working with Stuart Hameroff, they propose that these gravity-driven quantum collapses aren't just happening randomly out there. They think they're happening in very specific structures inside our brain cells.
Inside the neuron.
Inside the neurons, yeah. In these things called neuronal microtubules, tiny little tubes. And the idea is that these microtubules can somehow maintain the delicate quantum state's coherence long enough for gravity to cause these orchestrated collapses. And these collapses, happening in a coordinated way, are what Penrose and Hameroff argue give rise to our actual conscious moments, our experiences.
So consciousness is literally a quantum gravitational effect happening in the brain.
According to Orch-OR, yes.
Yep.
And there's another crucial piece to Penrose's thinking, which comes from mathematics, actually, from Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Gödel, that's deep stuff, too.
It is. And Penrose takes from Gödel the idea that human understanding, human mathematical insight anyway, isn't algorithmic. It's non-computable.
Meaning a computer can't replicate it.
Exactly. He argues our minds can grasp truths that no formal system, no computer following rules could ever prove or discover on its own.
Right.
So a key takeaway from Penrose is this. He sees a fundamental limit to what artificial intelligence, as we currently conceive it based on computation, can ever achieve. Because consciousness itself, he thinks, operates in a non-computable way.
That's a huge challenge to the standard AI narrative, isn't it? The idea that you just build a complex enough machine and consciousness will sort of pop out.
A direct challenge, yeah. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look at Federico Faggin.
The inventor of the microprocessor comes from a very different world.
Totally different background.
Yeah.
But his perspective on consciousness also underwent this, huge transformation.
He had some kind of personal experience.
A very powerful one, he describes it. Back in 1990, something involving unconditional love, light. It completely shifted him away from his earlier materialist views.
Yeah. So what did that lead to? What's his model?
He calls it quantum information panpsychism, or QIP. And the core idea here is completely flipped from the usual. He says consciousness doesn't arise from matter.
Okay.
Instead, consciousness is primary. It's the fundamental reality. He talks about a basic field of quantum information existing somehow outside of our normal space and time.
Outside space-time.
Yeah. And space-time itself, and matter, and even the information that our computers process, all of that emerges from these underlying conscious fields.
So the universe is fundamentally conscious information.
That's the gist of it. Consciousness isn't the product, it's the source. It's the foundation of everything.
That is a radical reversal.
It really is. And it has implications for things like free will. Faggin sees free will not as some illusion cooked up by brain chemistry.
Which is the standard scientific sort of explanation.
Right. He sees it as a genuine, fundamental act. Conscious intent actually guiding quantum collapse events within these fields. Real choice happening at a basic level.
And what about science itself? Mathematics. How do they
Exactly.
fit in if consciousness is primary?
That's another fascinating angle. He views math and science not as descriptions of some totally separate objective reality out there.
Waiting to be discovered.
Exactly, but more as creations within consciousness. Tools and frameworks that consciousness itself develops to understand its own nature, its own possibilities.
So science becomes a kind of self-exploration by consciousness.
Sort of, yeah. He really advocates for integrating science and spirituality. He sees the whole process of evolution as the universe, which he sometimes calls the One, becoming more aware of itself, deepening its self-knowledge.
And he has that analogy too, right? About the body.
The drone analogy, yeah, it's quite vivid. He says the human body is like a complex drone,
Okay.
but consciousness is the pilot operating it remotely, which of course leads to the idea that consciousness, the pilot, might persist even after the drone, the body, stops functioning.
Right. That definitely opens up questions about life after death. Okay, that drone analogy really sticks with you. Let's move to our third thinker, Bernardo Kastrup,
The philosopher.
the philosopher championing analytic idealism. This sounds like another perspective that really turns our everyday assumptions upside down.
It absolutely does. Kastrup's argument, in a nutshell, is that all of reality is fundamentally mental. There's nothing but consciousness, ultimately.
So no underlying physical stuff at all.
Nope. What we perceive as the physical world, as matter, that's not some independent substance. It's simply how certain mental processes appear. It's a representation, a manifestation of underlying mental activity.
Activity within what, though?
Within a universal consciousness, which he often calls mind at large.
Mind at large. Okay.
Think of it like this universal mind experiences itself in various ways. And we, as individual conscious beings, you, me, animals, we're like dissociated alters or fragmented aspects of this larger mind, like whirlpools in a stream.
Dissociated alters.
Wait,
Like in dissociative identity disorder.
he uses that analogy, yeah, to explain how one universal consciousness can appear as multiple, seemingly separate individuals. Each is a localized pattern of excitation within the broader mind. The really radical insight here is that the material world we see, touch, measure, it is consciousness, just in a particular form or appearance.
So when I look at this table, I'm not seeing atoms and molecules in the usual sense.
Not in the sense of them being the fundamental underlying reality, no. Kastrup uses his dashboard analogy here.
Ah, yes, the dashboard.
Right. The dials on your car's dashboard give you useful information about the engine temperature, fuel level, speed. But the dials aren't the engine itself, are they?
No, they just represent it.
Exactly. Kastrup says matter is like that dashboard. It's a representation of the underlying mental reality, tailored to our perspective as dissociated alters. It gives us information, allows us to interact, but it's not the engine. It's the appearance of mental processes when viewed from across a dissociative boundary.
Okay. So what does this mean for life? Are rocks conscious in this view?
No, he makes a distinction. He argues that all living organisms possess subjective experience, consciousness to varying degrees. Because a living organism is the external appearance of one of these dissociated segments of mind at large.
So life equals an individual consciousness.
Life is the image of an individual consciousness. Non-living matter, like a rock or a table, is the image of underlying mental processes, but not of a dissociated individual subjective viewpoint. It's just the background noise of the mind, so to speak, not an alter.
And the brain. What's its role if it's not creating consciousness?
For Kastrup, the brain isn't the generator of consciousness at all. It's simply what an individual's conscious processes look like when observed from the outside.
So if I look at your brain activity on an fMRI,
You're seeing the dashboard representation of my inner mental life. You're not seeing the consciousness itself, but its external appearance within the representation system we call matter.
interesting. It meshes a bit with Faggin's view, in a way. Does Kastrup touch on spirituality?
He does. He explicitly equates this universal mind at large with what people traditionally mean by God, but in a specific philosophical sense, more like panentheism, where the universe is in God, but God is also more than the universe. And he also has a view on free will.
Let me guess, it's not simple.
No. He talks about conditional free will. We have free will, but it's conditioned by the specific structures and patterns of our dissociated mental segment. Our choices are real, but shaped by who we fundamentally are within that larger mind.
Okay, wow. 3 really distinct, really challenging ways of looking at things. Penrose, Faggin, Kastrup. Despite coming at it so differently, where do they actually find common ground? What are the key overlaps?
That's maybe the most striking part. The biggest point of convergence, and it's huge, is their shared rejection of straightforward materialism.
Right, they all push back against matter as primary.
Absolutely. Every one of them argues, though using different frameworks, that consciousness isn't just some accidental byproduct of complex physical stuff happening late in the game. They all see it as somehow fundamental to reality itself.
How so for each?
Well, Penrose sees it tied to the fundamental physics of quantum gravity, happening right down at the microtubule level. Faggin argues it's the very ground of being, the quantum information field from which everything else arises. And Kastrup says it's literally all there is, the only actual reality. So the shared insight is really that the standard scientific story, putting matter first, is fundamentally incomplete or even wrong.
So they all elevate consciousness to a much more central, foundational role than conventional science usually does.
Precisely. Which leads straight into another convergence point. In all their models, consciousness underpins reality. It's not just along for the ride.
It's doing something crucial.
Yes. Well, whether it's Penrose's non-computable quantum gravity events, Faggin's primordial quantum information field acting with free will, or Kastrup's universal mind at large differentiating itself, consciousness is foundational.
And this relates to their views on AI, doesn't it?
It does. They all share a pretty strong skepticism about whether traditional AI, based on classical computation, can ever achieve genuine consciousness.
Why? What are their specific arguments there?
Well, we already mentioned Penrose's argument about non-computability consciousness involves something beyond algorithms. Faggin emphasizes that current AI lacks the intrinsic quantum-level awareness he believes is fundamental. AI manipulates symbols, but without inherent meaning or experience.
Just symbol processing.
Right. And Kastrup argues that consciousness, as we know it, is intrinsically linked to life, to metabolism, to being one of those dissociated alters of mind at large. A silicon computer just isn't that. It's part of the dashboard, not an entity experiencing the dashboard.
So different reasons, but the same conclusion about current AI limitations regarding true consciousness.
Exactly. And one final point of convergence, maybe a bit broader. They all seem to move away from a purely reductionist viewpoint. They lean towards a more holistic understanding of reality where consciousness isn't just explained away by lower-level parts, but is an irreducible and integral feature of the whole system.
Fascinating, these threads running through such different ways of thinking. But okay, let's flip it. Where do they really clash? What are the major divergences?
Well, the most obvious one is the proposed mechanism or nature of consciousness itself.
How it works, basically.
Yeah, or what it is. Penrose points to a specific physical process, that gravitational collapse within microtubules in the brain. Very mechanistic in a quantum way. Faggin talks more holistically about these quantum information fields outside spacetime involving fundamental free will. It's less tied to a specific brain structure.
Right.
And Kastrup goes even further. For him, there is no physical mechanism for consciousness because consciousness is all there is. It's the given. The question is how consciousness appears as physical, not how physical produces consciousness.
So totally different explanations or non-explanations for what consciousness fundamentally is.
Totally different. Their views on time also diverge quite a bit. Penrose, as we said, brings in retrocausality, but within a framework where time still seems to flow more or less normally otherwise.
A tweak to standard time.
Kind of. Faggin suggests time isn't fundamental, but emerges within consciousness, perhaps as a form of memory or sequential processing of the quantum information field.
Time is a feature of consciousness.
Yeah. And Kastrup sees time, like space and matter, as a secondary appearance, part of the dashboard representation within the timeless mind at large.
Wow. So fundamental disagreements on consciousness, time. What else?
The nature of mathematical reality. Penrose seems to lean towards a kind of Platonism. Mathematical truths exist independently, objectively out there for us to discover.
Like numbers and theorems are real entities.
Sort of. Faggin, as we discussed, sees mathematics more as a creation of consciousness, a language it develops.
A tool.
A powerful tool, yes. And Kastrup views mathematics as an inherent aspect of the structure of mind itself. The way mind behaves has mathematical properties.
So Platonic versus created versus inherent property. Okay.
And finally, there's definitely a spectrum regarding the spiritual overtones or implications of their work.
And how explicit they are about it.
Exactly. Penrose is very cautious. He sticks closely to the physics and mathematics, generally avoiding overt spiritual or metaphysical claims based on Orch OR.
Stays in the scientific lane.
Pretty much. Faggin, deeply influenced by his personal experience, fully embraces a spiritual perspective and explicitly seeks to integrate it with his scientific framework. The one, self-knowledge, consciousness after death, it's all in there.
Much more integrated.
And Kastrup, while using philosophical arguments, builds a rational metaphysical system, analytic idealism, that naturally resonates with many spiritual traditions, like idealism, panentheism, though he frames it in logical, analytical terms.
So, cautious scientist, integrated spiritual technologist, and rational metaphysician with spiritual echoes.
That's a pretty good summary of the spectrum, yeah.
This really paints a picture of a dynamic, ongoing, and pretty fundamental debate. Now, our analysis also touched on how these ideas land with, the broader scientific community. They face pushback, right?
Oh, definitely. These are not mainstream views, by and large, and they face significant critiques.
Okay, let's take Penrose's Orch OR first. What are the main criticisms there?
A major one, maybe the major one, is about biological plausibility. Critics argue that the brain is just too warm, wet, and noisy, as the saying goes, meaning it seems incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to maintain the delicate quantum states the coherence needed for Orch OR within living neurons for long enough. Quantum effects are usually incredibly fragile.
They get disrupted easily.
Very easily. Physicist Max Tegmark famously did calculations suggesting any quantum coherence in microtubules would decohere, basically fall apart, almost instantly, far too fast to be relevant for the timescale of conscious thought.
So the physics might not work in the biological setting. What else?
There's also a lack of direct, unambiguous experimental evidence specifically supporting gravitationally induced wave function collapse in the brain, or even that microtubules behave in the way the theory requires quantum mechanically.
So it's hard to test?
Very hard. Which leads to the criticism that it makes few unique, testable predictions that could definitively prove or disprove it compared to more conventional neuroscience. It's seen by many as highly speculative.
Okay. What about the criticisms leveled against Faggin's quantum information panpsychism, QIP?
Similar themes, actually. While his ideas about consciousness being primary are appealing to some, critics point to a lack of, empirical grounding.
Meaning hard evidence or experiments.
Yeah. It's difficult to see how you'd experimentally test the existence of a consciousness field outside spacetime or measure its properties. The theory doesn't seem to offer clear, specific predictions that could be verified or falsified through current scientific methods.
Is it more philosophical or metaphysical?
That's how many critics see it. It relies on assumptions about the fundamental nature of reality that aren't easily testable, and the precise mechanisms how consciousness actually gives rise to matter and space-time aren't fully spelled out in a way that allows for experimental probing.
Right. And Kastrup's analytic idealism, what are the hurdles it faces?
Kastrup's view faces perhaps the most fundamental challenge from our everyday experience, explaining the consistency and apparent objectivity of the physical world.
If it's all just mental, why do we all seem to agree that the table is solid or that gravity works the same way for everyone?
Exactly. How does intersubjective agreement arise so reliably if reality is fundamentally fragmented mental states? Critics question if idealism can fully account for the shared, predictable nature of the world we experience without just reintroducing something very much like an objective world independent of any particular mind.
How does he address that?
He argues the laws of nature are the regularities of the mind at large, the way the dream behaves, so to speak, and we experience it consistently because we're all segments of that same mind. But critics often find that explanation lacks sufficient explanatory power, especially regarding how individual consciousnesses emerge and interact so coherently.
And the lack of empirical verification.
That's also a major point. Like Faggin's view, it's a metaphysical framework, while Kastrup argues it's the most parsimonious explanation for certain data, like consciousness itself. It doesn't easily generate unique, testable predictions in the way a typical scientific theory might. It's an interpretation of reality rather than a predictive model in the scientific sense for many critics.
Okay, so while these are all really compelling alternatives to materialism, they each face serious questions and are definitely subjects of ongoing heated debate.
Absolutely. They are challenging the foundations, and that always invites intense scrutiny.
But let's speculate for a moment. If these kinds of perspectives, consciousness being fundamental, did gain more traction, what are some of the really big shifts we might see? What are the broader implications?
Oh, the implications could be massive, across the board. In science itself, you could see a fundamental rethinking of quantum mechanics. Is consciousness playing a role we haven't accounted for?
Like in the measurement problem.
Potentially, yes. Our theories of evolution, the origin of life, the nature of mind itself, all might need radical revision if consciousness isn't just a late product, but somehow primary or deeply interwoven from the start. We might also find new ways to approach phenomena currently at the fringes of science, things that don't fit the materialist model easily, maybe certain subjective experiences or other anomalies.
And beyond science.
Yeah.
And society.
Yeah.
Ethics.
Well, if you start to see consciousness as fundamental and interconnected, like in Faggin's or Kastrup's view especially, that could foster a greater sense of empathy, maybe? Interconnectedness.
A shift away from pure individualism or competition.
Perhaps a potential shift towards cooperation, a different valuation of life and experience over purely material accumulation. And of course, our whole understanding of death, personal identity, what it means to be, that could be profoundly altered if consciousness isn't tied solely to the physical body.
That's a huge potential impact on worldview. What about specific fields, like philosophy of mind?
Well, the famous hard problem of consciousness, how does subjective experience arise from physical stuff? It might dissolve or be completely reframed. If consciousness is fundamental, the problem becomes how matter arises, not how consciousness does.
The hard problem flips.
Exactly. Reductionist approaches would likely lose a lot of ground to more holistic views, maybe panpsychism or idealism. The whole mind-body relationship gets redefined, with the body potentially seen as a representation of mind, not the generator of it.
And physics. You mentioned quantum mechanics.
Yeah, beyond just QM interpretation, there might be attempts to actively incorporate consciousness into fundamental physics. Could we develop a true theory of experience that perhaps unifies gravity and quantum theory by putting consciousness at the base?
Wow.
Our understanding of space-time, cosmology, maybe they need to be recast, not just as objective structures, but as structures related to or emergent from consciousness.
And finally, AI ethics. That seems like a really practical area this touches.
Hugely practical, especially now. If these thinkers are right, and true consciousness requires something more than computation, whether it's quantum effects, life, or being part of a universal mind,
then building conscious AI might be impossible, or at least not possible with current methods.
right, which forces us to distinguish sharply between simulating intelligence or behavior and creating genuine subjective experience. Our ethical focus might shift, maybe towards prioritizing AI for augmenting human capabilities rather than trying to replace human consciousness. And critically, it raises huge ethical flags about how we treat AI. If we start anthropomorphizing complex algorithms, treating them as if they're conscious when they're not,
We might devalue actual conscious beings, human or otherwise.
that's a real danger Kastrup in particular warns about. The ethical implications of mistaking simulation for reality could be profound.
It's really clear that the ideas of Penrose, Faggin, and Kastrup, even with the debates and criticisms, offer this powerful, thought-provoking challenge to the mainstream.
They absolutely do. They force us to confront our basic assumptions about what reality is and what our place as conscious beings is within it.
A compelling counterpoint to traditional materialism.
Definitely. And these fundamental questions, what is consciousness? How does it relate to the physical world? They remain some of the deepest, most important mysteries we face. The dialogue between these contrasting, sometimes overlapping perspectives really highlights the depth and the stakes of this ongoing inquiry.
An inquiry with massive implications for science, philosophy, and, the future of technology like AI.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, here's something to chew on. If consciousness is indeed fundamental, as these thinkers propose in their various ways, how might our whole concept of information need to evolve?
Go on.
Well, we tend to think of information now as objective bits, data, physical states. But if consciousness is primary, could information itself have a subjective, experiential dimension we're currently missing? Could our purely physical view of information be fundamentally limited?
A deeper, more consciousness-infused understanding of information itself.
Exactly. What might that even look like? It's just one of those fascinating rabbit holes these perspectives open up for you to explore. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.